Hi, and welcome to this webinar on risk assessment. And I truly mean this. This is one of my favourite subjects, which I know is really sad. So I'm really excited to be here with you for the next 45 minutes talking about risk assessment. I have a little bit of a dry throat, so apologies for that throughout the session. What I really want to do, or what we really want to do, the ICW team and I, is help you. 45 minutes is not a lot of time. Risk assessment is quite challenging sometimes. You might need to spend a lot of time researching on it and figuring it out. But we really want to know any questions that you have. So we have the chat function. Please do ask any questions. If you want to just test it now to make sure it's all working okay and say hello in there, that would be great. This session is being recorded, so I won't mention any names or anything that come through if we see any on there, but we'll try and address any questions that you have about risk assessment. So let's get started. Please actively participate, as I've mentioned, ask any questions. Also, this is being recorded. Thank you. Someone's put hello in there. Hello to you too. And we also really want you to complete the questionnaire at the end. So any comments you have, any suggestions, or maybe further questions that the ICW team and I can help you with, please do fill that out in the questionnaire. And we really want to know how you're enjoying or if there's any changes that you're suggesting on these webinars. So please complete that questionnaire. It should automatically pop up at the end. So please try and do that. If you have any questions, then we have an email there saying emarketing@icw.io. If you have any questions, you can email them directly. So yes, and also we'll be recording, and the link there is to the webinars. If you've been here before, I can see some familiar names, which is really nice. So you might have seen some of the recordings before available on the ICW website, and that's the link to it below. So once this session is complete, we will be putting the recording on the ICW website for you to have a look over again. So very briefly, because you may have seen me before, my name is Geraldine Kosh, and I'll introduce myself. So I'm a product safety consultant based in London in the United Kingdom. I am also a business development consultant for ICW, and I support them with technical queries that they may have as well. I've worked in product safety for now over 20 years, and just some recent activities that you might be interested in. And just to let you know, actually, PAS 7055, which is on button and coin batteries, I had the absolute honour of being the technical author. That has been released just recently, a couple of days ago, actually. So a new edition of that, which is on button and coin batteries. And then PAS 7100, which is on recalls and corrective action, PAS 7050, which is about bringing safe products to market. I also worked on the Speak project, which is an amazing resource. Have a look on the internet, search it. It has got such a wealth of information. It is based and targeted at manufacturers and economic operators in China. So there's a lot of resources on there that are translated into Chinese, but I think it certainly helps with people all over the world if you're looking at selling products into the EU. And then I've also worked on the CAST project, so the coordinated activity for the safety of products. I've actually worked as a technical expert on risk assessment for that. And then most recently helped the Chartered Trading Standards Institute with a competency framework, which I think is awesome. We're doing cohort 3, I believe it is next week, on the business certificate of competency in product safety. So that's just a little bit about myself. And it's nice to see you again if I've seen you here before. Right. Well, I'm going to look at the chat quickly, just make sure no one's got any questions. No, it's all hello, which is great. Briefly introduced ICW. ICW are an amazing organisation. Gary, the co-founder, and also the team, Grace here and everybody are a phenomenal support for me when I have technical queries, when I have testing queries, inspection, etc. And as it says here on the slide, ICW is the pioneer for this. And they truly were one of the first organisations I had ever heard of that offers this service. And the way I summarise it is it takes the headache out of the admin of compliance. The admin of compliance is so important. It's vital, especially if you're facing a corrective action or, proactively you're trying to do the right thing for your products. It's really overwhelming trying to understand this, the global point of view, and the ICW team are phenomenal. I speak to them on a regular basis, You know, for example, there's a chemical expert that I contact quite a lot because I don't know all about chemistry. And he's really awesome and provides me with incredible support. So this is part of what ICW, I'm just being selfish here, does for me and helps me. But what can it do for organizations? It has an amazing array of tools, including AI tools, ensuring that you're complying with the regulatory or quality standards that you may have, which you can set yourself. If you're looking at quotes from test laboratories, they can help you do that. If you've got specific ones, again, they can help you do that. And they help administer the compliance process and also the checks. So if you're getting, for example, technical documentation, you want someone to help you check it. You know, maybe at the moment your team is a bit lean. I know that we're all sometimes facing that. We've got a lot of work to do and not enough time. They really can help support your team and then provide, not only do you get that information, but then analysing that and then giving that, you know, feeding it back and providing it in a way that you can communicate within the organisation on what you're doing on your compliance process. So that's just a little bit about ICW. Of course, if you want to know any more about what ICW can do for you, then feel free to contact me or ICW directly, and we will contact you and help assist you on any queries that you have. Okay, so let's get talking about risk assessment. So I want to see how many of you are as excited as I, which is probably not many because I know it's a little bit sad, about the topic of risk assessment. So we haven't got Menti here. We are going to do a poll a bit later on in Zoom, which hopefully works. But we did a Menti on this. So this visual here is from Mentimeter. And it was when we did the session in September 2023. And we asked, you know, what are your thoughts on risk assessment? So I want to ask you, what are your thoughts on risk assessment? If you can please put it in the chat, that would be great. And the reason is, like we mentioned, is I want to see if we can help you. It's a short time frame we've got, but I want to see if I can help you with some of those challenges that you may have. For example, what people put here before was it's complicated. I know that, I understand that, and I hope I'm going to help you with that today, because that is my mission in life, is to try and simplify things. GPSR concerns, which were very valid at the time and still are. So we have the new GPSR in Europe, which came out in December. It's a nice Christmas present in 2024. We've already done a webinar on that. The lovely Rutger did a webinar on that. And that has now, in my opinion, increased the importance, if that's the right way of saying it, of doing a risk assessment. So actually the obligations for the manufacturer is to do this internal risk analysis. It mentions risk. I've written it down here now. It mentions risk 130 times. To check my notes, and actually risk assessment 12 times. So it mentions it quite a lot in the new GPSR, but it's always been a requirement. And for most CE mark products, there is this implication, or it might be very, very clear, you have to do some form of risk assessment. So I will talk about that really briefly, but there is pre-risk assessment and post-risk assessment, which are really different. And I'm really going to focus on today the post-risk assessment. So this is when you've got a query on a problem, a query or a problem with a product, and you want to do a post-risk assessment. Pre-risk assessment, in my opinion, is really just looking at the hazards and risk mitigation. You're not necessarily assigning a risk level to it. Of course, you can if you want to, but I think that's quite a lot of resource and time. Of course, subject to seeing what's going to come from the European Commission. Maybe they'll release something that will help with that and some guidance, but there's nothing specific for pre-risk assessment, really. Well, there's something for electrical that I'll show you in a moment. So I just wanted to mention some of those on there. Let me have a look at what people are putting. Crucial, where to start, perfect. I think I'm going to help you with that. Standardize, we'll try. It's very important, it is, for sure. Risk assessment is crucial. This is brilliant. Okay, potential risk associated. Yeah, brilliant. It's a challenge, an opportunity, and advantage. Brilliant. It's a really great comment. So please feel free to add any other comments when I'm going through this. But my mission is to try and simplify this for you in the next 40 minutes. So let me talk to you about some methodologies that are out there. In the OPSS, and I know I've got an acronym on here and I haven't explicitly explained it, but I will to you now. So the OPSS is the Office of Product Safety and Standards. They're here in the UK. So they are the market surveillance, really the regulators for product safety. And what they're saying, and I think this is why this is so challenging on this, you know, why do people find it very challenging? It's because we are looking at predicting perceptions, behaviors, decisions, and linking this how they will typically engage with the product. And that can be really challenging, right? That's almost an art and a science in itself. So people really struggle with that. What I find really helps me with that is previous data. It doesn't mean it's 100% accurate. So with the OPSS Prism resources that are available on their website, they have a lot of links to some data sources that you could use. And I find that really, really helpful. But I think, not that I'm providing a solution here with this chart, but I'm just saying that this is why I think it's so challenging, because we're looking at behaviors and we can't always predict behaviors. However, in your businesses, you may have data on how consumers have used your products previously, whether it's right or wrong. That's a different thing. But if you're getting complaints that somebody's doing something with a product that you weren't inspecting, then you can use that. And that's kind of what the GPSR is implying as well. So I just wanted to mention that really, really briefly. So what do I think the challenges are? Somebody's put that in there. Data to support your risk assessment is really tough to find. I totally agree with you. So I'm going to give you some ideas. But to answer that really quickly, I would say look at your own resources. The internet is your best friend. Have a look on the internet, give it to people that you know or that you work with. If I have a toy, or it wasn't even a toy I was looking at yesterday, and I showed it to my daughter, I was like, what do you think this is? And she said to me, can I eat it? she couldn't eat it, by the way. But just understanding, what do people think when they get the product? And I think of all the work that I've done on risk assessment, and I've done quite a few sessions on risk assessment, the big challenges is estimating the probabilities. So how do you assign a number or even a qualitative statement to a particular behavior that's going to happen? So how do you estimate those probabilities? And how do you build that injury scenario to start with? And actually, a lot of this, I think, relates to confidence. If you asked me 15 years ago, if there's anyone on this webinar here now or watching the recording that knew me from 15, 20 years ago, you would know that I was incredibly nervous about doing risk assessments. But I'm not anymore, because I've had so much experience doing them. So the more you do them, the more you practice doing them, the more confident you get. And I think confidence is a thing too. So there's lots of training resources out there that you can do to help build confidence, but I would suggest just actually having a go. So what we're going to do in this session is I'm going to break down an example that's on the OPSS Prism website. They've got 6, I think. I'm going to show you in a moment. And I'm just going to break it down step by step. And hopefully that helps with some of these questions that you've got. And how did they do it? How did they address it? So just double checking. There's no specific questions in here, so we're good. So I'm going to give an introduction to risk assessment. I'm going to talk about the risk assessment process. Remember, when I'm talking about this, it's post-risk assessment. So the product's already out there. I mean, it might not be out there, actually. It might be that you've got it coming over on a ship or a container or something. It's already been released. But we're not talking pre the design stage, basically. That's a little bit different. So we're talking post-market. And I also want to mention the methodologies that I'll be talking about were actually written for market surveillance. So there might be some market surveillance officers here on the webinar. Welcome if you are, but it's written for them actually. So where are the risk assessment methodologies for businesses? Well, actually there aren't any. And when I'm saying that, I'm talking about 2 key ones in Europe and Great Britain. So I just want to highlight that. So you take from it, if you're a business, if you're a manufacturer, distributor, retailer, whatever you are, you take from it what works for you. Remember that this is written for market surveillance. And I think that's really important when we're looking at presumption of serious risk, etc., which I'll talk about in a moment. So I'm hopefully going to give you some practical tips. And of course, question and answer. I'm not going to stop at the end. I'd just like you to send them to me while we're going, because I think it's just easier if you're talking about a specific slide, then I can address it at that moment. Okay, so the methodologies that are out there, there's quite a few. There might be more. If you know of any more, then do let me know in the chat. You've got Decision 2019-417, which actually has been taken out of European law. I was a little bit surprised to see that had happened, but it's happened. It's not explicitly explained yet that it's been replaced by the delegated regulation, but it's kind of insinuated, which is interesting because those of you that know law, or you can look at this yourself, a decision and a regulation are very different. So this is really interesting. So if you're not aware of the delegated regulation 2024-3173, I highly recommend you take a look at that. I've pulled out the parts on presumption of serious risk for this session just to show you, because I think it's really important. But I still think as well, even though Decision 2019-417 has been taken out in theory of European law, it's still available. You can still download it. And I still think it's an interesting read to have a look at it. And I'll explain some of the reasons why in this session. Then, of course, we've got the PRISM Product Safety Risk Assessment Methodology, which is here for market surveillance officers in Great Britain. I'm being a bit pedantic about this now, but in Great Britain, so we're talking England, Scotland and Wales. So that's the market surveillance officers would be using that. If you're based in Northern Ireland or Europe, you'd be looking at the European framework or the delegated regulation. The reality is, of course, with a regulation, that's a different form of law, but you can use whatever one you like, really, that helps you. And they're very similar anyway. So I'll talk about that. I wanted to mention the concept of a safety assessment, which is kind of a design risk assessment, if you want to call it risk, and Article 18 of the Toy Safety Directive. So this has been around for a long time. So manufacturers shall, before placing a toy on the market, carry out an analysis of the chemical, physical, mechanical, electrical, flammability, hygiene. You get the point, right? They have to look at those hazards. That's basically, in my opinion, what I think that the GPSR is asking for in Europe. So before you put the product on the market, have a look at the hazards that are there and how are you going to mitigate them? How are you going to reduce them happening? It could be that you apply EN 71, for example, with the toys. And then you have Senelec Guide 32 on the low voltage directive. So electrical products worth having a look at. And then you have the nomograph. So there's quite a few resources out there you can have a look at for risk assessment. But for this session, I'm really going to be focusing on PRISM and a little bit on the delegated regulation for Europe. So I hope that makes sense. So I want to ask you a question and I want to see if the poll works. If the poll doesn't work or you don't know how to use it, then please do just put it in the chat. But I want to ask you, what is the risk associated with this product? So this is the Samsung. I don't actually know if the picture is the Galaxy Note 7, but the specific one, the Galaxy Note 7, that was one that was subject to a significant corrective action back in 2016. I don't know if anyone remembers that. But I want to ask you, what do you think? So if I have to ask you now, you're in a meeting, maybe you're working for Samsung or you're distributing this or however, and somebody says, right, we've got these things coming in. What do we do? What's the risk? What's the risk? Tell me what the risk is now, putting you under pressure. Do you think it's low, medium, high, or serious? And the information that you have is that it's got a lithium-ion battery, which can overheat, catch fire, poses obviously a risk of burn. There's 1 million units that are out there. You've got 92 reports of the batteries overheating, and this is specifically in the US, including 26 reports of burns and 55 reports of property damage, including fires in cars and a garage. So what do you think the risk is associated with that? If I said to you, you have to decide, do you think it's low? Do you think it's medium? Do you think it's high? Do you think it's serious? So a few of you have put serious in the chat. Oh, in the poll's working. So thank you so much. It's working great. Now, what I'm going to do actually, I'm going to share this with you. Can you see this if I put this here? Right. We have around 60% are saying serious. It's moving. Nearly 30% high. None of you are saying low. Okay, medium or high. So there you go. You know how to do risk assessment. We're done. But that's really great. And sometimes you have to make these decisions. And I think there is nothing wrong with making that decision. The one thing that I ask you to do is to document it. So whatever that thought was in your head, where you're saying, right, there was 1 million, there was 92, I did this, and that's why I thought it's serious. And then you might get more information that comes in. You may get, another 92 the next day. Hopefully you don't. But this is the thing with risk assessment, is that it can evolve and it can change. And sometimes people, ask me to do a risk assessment. It takes time to do it, but it is subject to change if I get more information. And that comes back to the point of where we're saying, well, where's the data? You might not have the data to hand right now, but you need to go and get sales data. You need to get test report data. And then while you're doing that, you can instinctively say, I think it might be this, or maybe you don't want to, that's fine. But the one thing I ask you to do is write down and say, why did you think that at that time? So let's do a little exercise. if we do some maths, which I get very nervous about maths, and I already had to go through this with my colleague who is a lot better at maths than me, and I'm sure I asked my daughter about it as well. There's 1 million. Even if we just do simple math on this, so we're talking about 92 over 1 million, and that gives us a number. And this is the number that they're looking for when you're doing risk assessment. I just find it's quite useful to put it in a percentage or a fraction if you can, to just try and get that perspective. Then straight away, looking at this chart here, I can see that we're sitting here. And I struggle with this. I really struggle with this. So the one thing that I do, and I did this before doing this session, is I use the EU methodology. You can also use the PRISM risk assessment Excel spreadsheet to just quickly put the information in and use it as a calculator. Because I always doubt myself. I'm like, oh, where is it sitting? Is it really here? Where is it? The maths can sometimes be a bit challenging. You've also, just while I'm showing you this, you've got a template library here where you could pick, if I pick hair dryers, flammable burns, where it will start to give you some information to go with. You have to put the probabilities in, but it gives you the steps. So you've got some templates here. So this is the EU. If you search for EU Saga, which is great because previously it used to be really difficult to find this, but if you search on your internet EU Saga, SAGA, it will find that for you. So you've already kind of done it. The problem is this isn't correct, okay? Because when you're doing risk assessment, you're not going straight into that first step. They're not automatically going to lead to that injury. There has to be steps that happen. So I wouldn't, if I ever saw a risk assessment that had one step in it, I'd question it, or you'd have to explain. You know, there might be valid reason for it, but explain why you've only got one step. With me, there'd have to be more than one step. So this is kind of what you could say, worst case scenario. Also, to add to this, some people don't like using the sales data. I mean, I think it's a great sanity check, because if you're coming out, and we'll talk about quality assurance, if you're coming out with a risk probability at the end of a 1 in 10, for example, of a serious, which I'll talk about in a moment, of a level 4 of a death, but you've sold 20 million products, it's not work. It just doesn't fit right. It just doesn't work. So I hope that makes sense. And I just wanted to do a little live risk assessment with you. And I really appreciate you filling in the poll and having a go at that. Okay, so how do we know about the severity of harm? You can see here, this is the chart, which is the same in the OPSS PRISM methodology as it is in the EU methodology. What we have here on the left is we have the harm severities from the OPSS PRISM document. So it has a level 1, which is like first aid, not normally by a doctor. It gives examples, minor cuts, 6% of body surface, etc. It also talks about multiple casualties, which is not mentioned, I don't believe, in the delegated regulation or the EU methodology. So that's something that the OPSS PRISM methodology, that's how it looks. In the delegated regulation, it looks like this. I actually prefer, and I don't know if it's just because I've been used to it for so many years, what's in decision 2019-417. So it has type of injury, and then it gives me specific examples to go with. Again, this is up for you to interpret and amend. You know, if you don't agree on the 5 centimeters, you know, you think it should be 4.5 or whatever it is, or you find some data that changes this for you, then that's up to you. This is really just a guide, in this decision and this information. So that's how you work out the severity of harm. And that's one of the things that I tend to do first. If somebody comes to me and I say, right, you know, are we looking at here, you know, a paper cut, or are we looking at, you know, something that can kill somebody? And that's really, really important, because if there's a potential for a level 4, remember that the risk assessment in the end, we're talking it has to be less than or more than 1 in a million we're talking about here. So I hope that makes sense. You know, you've got more chance of a level 1 being low risk than a level 4. So for me, that's one of the steps that I personally do. And I want to find that out. I want to get data on that. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is this presumption of serious risk, which I think was quite a significant thing that was in the delegated regulation. I've put that here so you can search it up yourself. Remember, this is for market surveillance officers, but I think if you're a market surveillance officer, really useful for you to know. If you're a business, it's really useful for you to know that this is what they're going to be using. In my opinion, we should be working together. You know, we're all trying to save consumers and protect consumers, and we want to do that and sell safe products. So It's interesting to look at this. It's a lot of text on the slide. So have a look at the delegated regulation, but I just want to highlight this point. So in 4.1, it says that risks posed by a product shall be presumed a serious risk in the following cases. If the product is linked to a probable harm level corresponding to severity level 3 or 4, and I've already explained that to you, and consumers and end users cannot be reasonably expected to take the necessary precaution measures to protect themselves. So if it's like a hidden hazard, they're not obvious, you know, it's not a sharp knife, for example, or to prevent the materialization of the risk, or they're not adequately informed, you know, the warnings on it, etc. So remember, level 3 or 4, we're talking about this. We're talking about something that will affect the functioning for more than 6 months, or basically death. So that's what they're saying here as A. In B, they placed on the market on an online marketplace, having listed it as an online interface and indicate the product poses a serious risk. It's been subject to a recall, withdrawal, or removal of online contact based on voluntary measures. It contains a chemical substance. There's a well-documented evidence of certain features, and they've given small parts for children under 36 months, so under 3 years old. Highly flammable fancy dress, highly flammable nightwear, childcare articles posing drowning risk, drawstrings, electrical products with defective components that can lead to electrical shock or fire. So I think that's really important for you to be aware of. Now, OPSS Prism have a similar document, but it's a bit less, doesn't have as many items in it. And they also agree with chemical, category 3 PPE, which basically, if that fails, if that doesn't work, then it is life-threatening. And then product hazards assessed by OPSS as a serious risk. And they have a specific example of an angle grinder chainsaw disc attachment that you can see here on the slide. So I just wanted to let you know that the reality of this is that in theory, you could have a product that's deemed serious risk in EU, but not in GB. And I think that's just something interesting and where we are at the moment. So how do you express the probabilities? Sorry. So you can do this quantitatively, so by a number, such as a fraction, or qualitatively, such as very frequent or frequent. And these are my favorite things within these documents. So the delegated regulation, which wasn't in Decision 2019-417, so I definitely welcome this, is if you're really stuck or you're in a room and you're saying, you know, well, how likely is it that, you know, the lithium ion battery on the Samsung is going to go up? There's 10 people in the room, 2 people put their hands up, so you say it's 2 in 10, and that's what you document. Okay, and then you can say, right, well, that means it's you know, common or frequent or wherever you are based on the number of people. Does that fit right with you? Or you can say to somebody, do you think it's frequent? Do you think it's rare? Do you think it's occasional? For example, a child mouthing on a product is not going to be rare, right? They tend to do that because of their behaviors, and it depends what the product is. So you can use this to translate qualitative to quantitative, or vice versa. Now, in the OPSS Prism, it's very similar, but a bit different in terms of the language, but a similar tool that you can use to translate. So I would use this if I was struggling, if I was in a room, I had a team, or I could just on my own, but you should also get it checked, and we'll come to that in the equality assurance bit. I would just use this first. If I didn't have time to research or go anywhere, I would just be looking at these charts. So I hope that helps with the data to support your risk assessment, because if you don't have any data, just use these charts. That's what I would say. And then you can wait. You can use this, wait till you get the data, which might be in testing, or that you've got to spend, you know, 2-3 hours or an hour looking at Google Scholar or looking at injury data. That's fine. But if you don't have time to do it at that moment, I would use this. Sometimes for some of my probabilities or points in the critical path, I can't find any data. So even after an hour or 2 or a day researching, there is no data. So therefore, I just come back to using these charts. So let's walk through the OPSS Prism methodology, which in my opinion is very similar. There are differences. It does add parts onto it. I think if you do the OPSS Prism, you probably are doing the EU methodology anyway, but you need to be careful on, you know, who you're doing this for, etc. I would say that if you're doing it in Europe for a market surveillance officer and sending it to them, use the Saga tool so they understand that methodology. And basically step 3 is where the EU method comes in. So all of this other stuff around it, you were probably doing anyway before OPSS PRISM came out. It just wasn't maybe documented. And I think it's really important to document those things. So the first step in PRISM, and this is all within the PRISM guidance documents that you can find online, is the identification of a non-compliant product. And I just want to add something to that. It doesn't mean that all compliant products are safe. I've had examples where a product is compliant, possibly. That is debatable, right? If we go into production control, etc., with CE marking. But if the product is truly compliant, it still can pose a risk. There might be things that influence it, social media, people start changing their behaviors. So I just want to add that caveat. And like I said, this is written as a tool for you to use and amend and make work for your business, really. So can the product be presumed to present a serious risk? I've just given you the information where you'd find that. So if this was in theory a chemical non-compliance, you can automatically assume both in GB and EU, it's going to be a serious risk. However, that is rebuttable. So if you wanted to do a toxicological risk assessment, you want to debate it, then that's fine. But there are some assumptions that a market surveillance officer would make. So is a full risk assessment required? Do you need to do a risk triage? For example, if you had a product that the CE mark was incorrect, everything else was perfect. You had all of your test reports, you did all your production controls, everything was perfect, just the CE mark wasn't the right size. You know, that could be deemed as an administrative non-compliance, and you don't really need to do a risk assessment on that. So there is a section in the OPSS PRISM guidance document that explains what risk triage is. And I just wanted to highlight it really quickly. So then you're into your risk assessment. And this is, like I mentioned, this is very similar to the EU methodology. So you're looking at the product, the hazards, who can be harmed, the scenarios, you determine the level of risk, and then you come out with this low, medium, high, or serious. And that's how you do your risk assessment. Now, this is not, part 4 is not in the EU methodology. So the risk evaluation, basically what this means is it tolerable? So there are some things that we just don't tolerate. So especially when it comes to examples like childcare products, probably I would say the 6 items that were in the EU delegated regulation, you know, I'd question if that was, if it came out with one of those products, because people don't tend to tolerate it. And I think if it could be made safer, that can affect the tolerability. I also think a huge thing that business struggles with this is your business tolerability. So what is the culture of your business and how much are you willing to tolerate or accept in terms of risk? And I think if you can define that and you can understand that, you're a good way to sorting out this risk evaluation, because obviously some brands are going to be different to others, and that's very, very difficult to define. But if you can define that, I think it's brilliant. So I hope that makes sense. So risk evaluation, is it tolerable to the public? Then you do your quality assurance and your reporting. So with me, I always work with a colleague. I'm very, very fortunate as well if I have any childcare products. I have a pediatrician, so a child doctor who I work with who will review the work for me. And that comes back to confidence as well. Like, it really helps me. I've done expert witness risk assessments. If I'm going to be cross-examined in court, I want to make sure that I've done the best that I can for this, you know, for the product and for the court as well. So having somebody that can actually review the report and have a look at it and sense check it and question me, you know, I think a healthy debate on risk assessment is really great, and that's what you need. So that quality assurance and also the recording. And then finally, risk management. In some cases, I would be going straight to this. You know, can you manage the risk? Then just do it. And that's what you should do, and then do some form of corrective action on how you can do it. But of course, sometimes people need to go through the risk assessment process, and you should. So I hope that made sense. Looking at data, and I'm going to go through an example really quickly, but this is again taken from the OPSS PRISM website. They've got data sources. So somebody asked about data to support, and maybe you know about this, and if you didn't, hopefully it helps you. Have a look at these. So accident statistics, fire statistics, mortality statistics, my favorite database, which they just came out with the 2024 data, which I was really excited about. The National Electronic Injury Surveillance System by the CPSC in the US is phenomenal, and their complaints. And then you've got so it's 6 examples here, and I'm going to go through the first one, the cords and drawstrings on children's clothing. I'm going to walk through that really quickly, but you can go to the website and download those examples and see how they did those risk assessments, which I think is brilliant. I think it's really helpful having those examples there. So, no questions. I'm hoping everyone is still with me. So we're going to look at this child shorts and top. As I mentioned, it's there on the website. You can access this yourself. I just thought it was useful for me to pull it out and put it on the presentation and walk through it with you step by step. So this is an example. The product, you've got a summer garment, shorts and a top with decorative cords for children under 3. The cord is 342 millimeters in length, which is prohibited under EN 14682, which is under the GPSR 2005. So that's what's applicable in Great Britain at the moment. We don't have the new GPSR, which sometimes causes confusion. The regulations, it's a regulation in Europe. So it's non-compliant. It should comply with 14682 and it doesn't. Now, if you remember what I was talking about with the EU delegated regulation, this would automatically be considered serious risk, right? But we don't have this listed in the GB methodology. So again, you need to understand where you're selling the product to, where is it going, and what the legal framework is. But they've decided here to do a risk assessment, which I think is great. So we'll proceed with the risk assessment. I'm just pulling back the flow. The flow's in the document. You've got a non-compliant product. Is a risk assessment required? Yes, we think it is in this case. And then we're going to go through this process of doing the risk assessment. The triage process, just for your information, is on the slide there, and you can see that in the guidance document. So prepare. What I think is phenomenal is that the OPSS, so the Office of Product Safety and Standards, have actually put their thought process. And this is the one thing that I was a little bit, that I thought was a challenge with the EU methodology. I love the EU methodology also, but the most important thing to do is write down why. And what I'm saying by that is, if I show you here, if you do this methodology here, if you use this tool and you write a probability, so it says here product fails during a normal operating condition. If I put a probability of 0.1, what is so important is just to explain why you've done that. If you use the chart that I showed you earlier, or you're just guessing it, that's absolutely fine. And the PRISM methodology, the Excel spreadsheet, on the side, it asks, what is this based on? Is it based on judgment? Is it based on data? And keep that data source. If you found, so product fails, that you've done some testing and that you've got a certain percent fail within that amount of time, then that's your data. That's what you're using. You're using your test data. So it's really important to explain why you've come out with that probability. So what they've done is they've found some really great resources, which I think if you sell clothing, I would highly recommend keeping this information and storing it. So they say very young children are especially vulnerable to strangulation because of their heads. They weigh proportionately more than their bodies. There's the footnote with the resource that we found and why we're saying it. They talk about the windpipes. They talk about the physiology of children and under pressure. Then they're looking at the US CPSC data, and that there were 27 deaths and 70 non-fatal incidents involving entanglement with children clothing drawstrings. And they've got the data, and then they've looked at data from China, which I think is great too. So I wanted to highlight that to you and highlight taking a look at that particular resource. And as you can see, they've got the information that they've used. Some of it may be scientific or primary source data. Some of it might be anecdotal. I have used in my risk assessment, Mumsnet, for example, or looking at how do people use things, because I can't find anything else. And that just gives an indication. Again, I put next to you, kind of weight what you're saying next to it. And then it's about your confidence in it, which I'll come back to in a moment. And then they've written here, just on the example, that this is a worked example. They haven't given the manufacturer, the model, the batch numbers, but that is what you should do if you're doing an assessment. So just going back to how we do this step by step, the product's defined. We're now looking at entanglement and strangulation. And this is why I don't think this methodology can be fully used for pre-assessment, so design risk assessment, because if you're walking through all these critical paths for every single possible hazard on your product, it will take a long time. So I'm not saying you can't do it. I just think that it's not the best way to do it, in my opinion. I would go straight to risk management actually on that. So beforehand, if you identify there's a choking hazard, for example, or there's draw cords on it, then manage it, cut them, make them shorter. So then they've done a harm scenario. You've got 4 steps here. You've got a young child is wearing a top. with a decorative cord in a low supervision context, such as a playpen, high chair, bouncer, car seat. The decorative cord is attached to the top, becomes entangled. The child cannot free themselves from the source of entrapment, and then a death occurs, basically a level 4 injury occurs. So that's their scenario. And in the PRISM document, I think it says 4 or 5 steps is probably what you're looking at. If you're looking at, 20 steps, the longer it takes for something to happen, the less likely it is to happen. So that's the point of what they're saying there. Obviously, it's going to be whatever you feel it is, based on your assessment. So they've got the step 1, and then they've explained. So the summer garment is designed for children under 3. Children of this age are encouraged to have regular periods of sleep based on best judgment. So they're just saying it's their judgment. A conservative probability of 0.02 is given, that the likelihood of a child under 3 wearing the garment is placed in a cot to sleep based on this. So they've just explained it, and that's where you can have a healthy debate with somebody. I highly recommend, they only put the 0.02, and you can check my maths on here, and I always get worried when I show this, but 0.02 is 1 in 50 or 2%. I highly recommend doing that, because if somebody questions me, it just makes more sense in my brain if you say to me 2% or 1 in 50. 0.02 doesn't compute very well in my brain. So the next step, you can have a look at the website yourself. Again, they've explained the answer. They've come out with their probability, and I've just added the fraction and percent. Again, the step 3, based on best judgment, this is the number they've come out with. And then level 4, they've explained that again and given some information and data. And then you do the compound probability. So you do 0.02 times 0.01 times 0.1 times 0.1, and then it gives you the final probability, which then you need to put then in the chart. You can use the tools that you've got. So we're looking at the level of risk. So the compound probability of all them, and then it comes out with a 1 in 500,000, and then it comes out with a medium risk. So that's how they've done that risk assessment. So I hope that makes sense. It was a very quick tour through an example, but the great news is that you can find these on the OPSS PRISM website and have a walk through them yourself. So where are we on the chart? We're here. That's where we're sitting with that particular example. I do want to mention this. This is really a decision-making tool. If you're selling 1 million versus 2 product, this really is in the PRISM guidance document to make you think. So, what's the likelihood here? If it's a 1 in 500,000 chance of this happening, and, you've sold 50 million, then that's a lot that we're talking about. So it's a consideration to think about if we're looking at the number of sales, and that's what the market surveillance officers will use. So it could be subject to change. Sometimes I've done an assessment and I've said, I don't think it changes. If I come out with a medium, I don't think it changes based on the number of sales, or maybe you don't know it, and I'll add that into the report. Now, uncertainty and sensitivity is basically where one of you is saying, I think it's a 1 in 10 chance, and somebody else says, I think it's a 1 in 1,000. Try it, change the numbers and see if it makes a difference. Sometimes it doesn't make a difference, it depends. But I would document that. And then the uncertainty, there's a whole section in the PRISM document that talks about how certain are you. So what they've done here is they've said there's a medium level of uncertainty because they've got some data, but some of it's basically based on judgment. So they've just explained that. And I think that's a really useful thing to do. And then you do that evaluation. Remember earlier we spoke about tolerability. Is it tolerable to have a t-shirt and shorts with long draw cords on it? It's not, because it's just not accepted. It shouldn't be. Or a strangulation happening to a young child. It's generally not tolerated. So that's part of the risk evaluation, and you can document that. So the last steps, and we've just got 2 minutes left of the session. I just want to check that any questions coming in. There's one. So the last steps is the quality assurance. So obviously you send it to your colleagues, have a conversation, and then you manage the risk. So you eliminate, in this case, you would cut the cords to make them shorter, or maybe you have to do a corrective action and do a recall, etc. Mitigate or warning. And it is in that order. We highly recommend that you eliminate if you can. If not, you mitigate and then you warn. I'm just going to put on the screen, information if you want to ask any questions directly. And then how many steps to injury is expected in the post-market risk assessment for EU? I can't remember if in the document it says, but I think it's similar examples. So they give examples. If you look at decision 2019-417, they've got examples at the end. And I think it's a similar amount of steps. Actually, sorry, I've got the answer here. They're saying here, maximum of 5. But I think it depends. I think great question, but I think it's case by case and it depends on it. I would question any more than 5 or 6 because I would be like, okay, are you deliberately trying to make this really long so that it doesn't happen? So that's what it says here on the Saga tool, maximum of 5. I hope that answers the question. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure, and I mean this, and I know it's a little bit sad, but I love talking about risk assessment. So I really appreciate that you spent the last 45 minutes with me, and I hope you have a wonderful day and a safe day. And if you have any questions, then please do let us know. I will quickly put the questionnaire in the chat, but it should also pop up, and we'd really appreciate it. The video will be available online for you to have a look at after. Someone's asked about pre-market risk assessment. It's a different, I would use a different approach, to be honest, but if you want to, you can contact the ICW team. You can reach out to me. The email's there, and I'm happily advise you on that. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day.